And that is because of fears that I think are understandable, though regrettable, that research on biological basis of criminality and violence will end up embodying racial bias. So the research on genetics and violence has been plagued, which I think is not clear that it's much worth funding, but even if it were, it's been plagued by controversy because people are afraid that it will say, we have more African Americans in prison because genetically they are more inclined to violence. Now, I would hope and expect that not to be the finding, but I can understand why African American organizations and activists would be worried about that, given the nature of, given our society. So that's an additional political problem that I would worry about in terms of political support for research on biology and crime. Yes?
A follow-up on a related subject. In the early 20th century, the predominant view was that crime was caused by biology.
Yeah.
And then I guess the prevailing consensus was that it was a social environment that caused crime.
Yeah.
Whether any of this new stuff works or not, will it have the effect of pushing biology back as the cause of crime, whether it is or not?
I think it's swinging that way already. Maybe appropriately, maybe inappropriately. I think there are some biological sides that probably are appropriate. Things like genetics, I suspect, are not going to turn out to be very powerful, except, of course, for the one very well-known violence gene, which you and I both carry, but none of the women in the room do. And we got one great genetic marker for predisposition to violent crime, and that's the Y chromosome. There's a wonderful book by a now dead Stanford historian named Carl Degler called In Search of Human Nature, I think is what it was called. It ends in the late 60s, but he looks at the arc of basically social science explanations for a lot of social issues, from heavily biologically determined in the late 19th century and early 20th century to particularly, and he thinks World War II was a turning point, part again of the very complicated, widespread reaction to the Nazis, in some respects in the U.S., to a much more complete blank slate view, and he was already beginning to see the swing back. I think the swing back is fairly far advanced. Where the truth is, and my own view is, if the question is something caused by environment or genes, is it nature or nurture? Almost always the answer is yes. It's almost always a combination of the two. Even in things like genetics, there are exceptions. Huntington's disease, if you have the allele for Huntington's disease, you've got more than 36 CAG repeats in your Huntington gene in a particular section on chromosome 4, the only way you will not die of Huntington's disease is to die first from something else. But that's the rare exception. Most genetic things are much more susceptible to environment and chance and so on. So, yeah, I think it's swinging. Whether it's reached, how close it's reached to the end of the pendulum for this, the end of the swing for this cycle, I don't know. And part of it will depend on whether anything comes from it. If it's useful, we'll use it. Of course, what this talk is about is I'm worried that if it's not useful, we'll still use it. Other questions? Yeah.
You've touched on genetics in a couple of your answers now, and I've got a question in what I think is an easy part and a more difficult part. The easier part is, do you see a difference in what we've talked about today when you compare traditional pharmacological and surgical interventions versus genetic interventions such as gene therapy? And let me go on with the more difficult part.
Let me start that one before you get to the hard one. Well, yes, in the sense that gene therapy almost has never worked. There is no gene therapy to speak of. There is gene transfer research. But to take the question more broadly, do I think there's a difference between neuroscience-based explanations or brain-based explanations on the one hand and genetic explanations on the other? I think they both share some similarities. Biologically based, they share an aura of inevitability, which I think is only an aura. I think is a false assumption of inevitability in some of these cases. They share sort of an allure and a glamour of science and scientism. They're different in some respects too, though. And genes are family shared and ethnic and cultural groups shared in a way that brains are not necessarily, although in fact the shared environment will shape brains in some similar kinds of ways. Mainly, I think neuroscience is much more likely to be a much more powerful explainer of human behavior in most cases than genes, if only for the temporal aspect. My behavior right now may be influenced to some extent by what alleles in a sperm and egg combined 58 years ago to be my zygote that became me. But I'm sure it's influenced pretty heavily by what synapses were firing a minute ago, or 5 minutes ago, or what my brain structure looks like. So to the extent neuroscience is dealing with the present, and the brain has integrated as the result of all the experiences you've gone through, as well as your genes, the genes themselves don't pick up all the experiential additions and the chance additions which the brain does. So I think they're similar but different.
Okay. That actually kind of leads into my second part.
Make the second point the last question.
Oh, okay. Assuming that an association were validly
An association between what?
between occurrence of an allele of a gene and a criminal behavior.
Yep. I've even got a good one for you, but go ahead.
What additional issues would be raised in a germline modification intervention where
Okay.
the offender's children?
Here's an actual real example. I talked about the violence gene we know, the SRY gene, which is the main sex-determining gene on the Y chromosome. There's actually another violence gene. It's called MAOA. It's on the X chromosome. There is research which was fascinating and has become a little controversial about two different forms of this. One which produces more, one which produces less. I'm blocking on the guy's name. He did the research in New Zealand with the Dunedin. Yes, the Caspi research. But there's an underlying piece of research that I think is not questioned. Back in 1993, a guy named Brakefield studied a family in the Netherlands where half of the males in the family had a distinctive syndrome. They were of low normal intelligence. They had long records of arrests for inappropriate sexual behavior, often with their sisters, or I think just because the sisters were nearby. I don't think they preferred the sisters particularly. Of violent crime, of arson. And the other half of the males were perfectly normal Dutch citizens. It turned out that this MAOA gene on the X chromosome, which is important for a reason I'll come to, the last answer may be a lot longer than the last question, was mutated in the affected males in a way that made it non-functional. They did not produce any MAOA. And in the healthy males, in the normal males, they had a normal MAOA gene. And it's on the X chromosome, which is important because women have two X chromosomes. So the women were carriers. They had one of these bad X's, but they had a good X, which produced enough MAOA to counterbalance the bad to make up for the bad X. The men only get one X. This is why men are colorblind at 100 times the rate of women. It's on the X chromosome. So these guys have a genetic allele that correlates, as far as we can tell, 100% with a particular syndrome that includes criminal behavior. The downside of this is this has only been found in this one family. Nobody quite knows why it hasn't been found in other families, but as a violence gene, it's not very helpful if it only affects this family, and I'd be curious to know what they do in the Netherlands with this family. But there is an example now. Somatic cell gene therapy, I think, would not trouble people particularly, assuming you could make it work. And of course, Penn has a long history with gene therapy and not working, but in good faith. But germline gene therapy worries some people. I'm not, again, if safety and efficacy is shown, I'm actually not among them.